This morning, we are going to hear Dr. Joseph Schumann. He has been the leader of the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County, New Jersey since 1974, and since 2008 has served as part-time leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture. Dr. Schumann teaches human rights at the graduate level at Columbia University and has taught at the United Nations University for Peace in San Jose, Costa Rica. He has published numerous articles in the Record of Bergen County, New Jersey. Joe recently announced his upcoming retirement for the end of this December, and we are honored and privileged to hear him speak this morning. His topic is America, the Exceptional Nation. Are we? Should we be? Can we be? And now, please welcome Dr. Joseph Schumann.
Thank you so very much, Susan. I want to extend also a very warm welcome to everyone to my backyard, to my home, those who are here in person and those who are joining us via Zoom. It's really great to have you. It's a perfect fall day. Boy, I'll tell you, when the weather is beautiful as it is today, my spirits automatically rise. Perfect weather, low humidity, moderate temperature, just beautiful. You know, I really can't avoid talking about the realities of the moment. As you know, we're in very, very difficult straits. And I feel it sort of my obligation as an ethical leader, both to try to define where we are, but also provide elements for hope as we look forward. And hopefully what I'll provide will be inspiring this morning. And let me just say, what I want to do is rather unusual. I want to sort of, the axis of my talk is a theme that has coursed through American history from the colonial period up until today, and look at it as a barometer as to where American society is at and how we can basically employ that concept as we move ahead to what I think is necessary, and that is the reconstruction, the rebuilding of American society after the plagues, plural, have passed us. And I hope both of them do in short order. I deliver my address this morning to you with a sense of irony, hope, and trepidation. Ethical Culture's founder, Felix Adler, believed that we should guide our actions inspired more by the future and what we can be, rather than by the past and what has been. In many of my talks, I've been guided by that perspective. But as I speak to you today, my ability to foresee the future, our American future, is utterly blocked from view by a solid brick wall that will confront us on November 3rd. If the incumbent wins the presidency, again, then my talk today, I got to tell you, lamentably, will be no more than an exercise in wishful thinking, a chimera, and a far-off dream. In short, it will be almost in vain and for the most part useless. But if the challenger emerges victorious, what I will share with you today may have some relevance and serve as a basis for action as we move into what will be, I think, a totally different future. We need to hope so, and moreover strive to make it so. We need to act as if our democracy and an America that we want to live in depends on it, because it does. This presidential election will be a radical inflection point in the American experience, and an election like none other. It will be the most consequential, perhaps, in at least 150 years of our history. Let me get this disturbing fact out of the way at the beginning. Donald Trump may lose the election, but we can be confident that he will not concede defeat. And what will eventuate could be protracted and very ugly. The interregnum between Election Day and January 20th will open space for all kinds of mayhem, from challenging the results of the election in the courts to Trump inciting his loyalists to foment violence in the streets. A tangible sign of hope, however, is that his administration has set up a team which is working with corresponding personnel from the Biden camp to enable a transition in the event that the latter is the victor. That is a concrete sign that things may not turn out as terribly as our worst presumptions lead us to believe. Let's hope that what this presages comes to pass. As we know, on Friday, Trump was hospitalized with coronavirus. Regardless of my own personal feelings, after all the lies and denials that have cost the lives of many thousands and the suffering of many more, this is one lie I think that Trump cannot undo. His appeal to his followers in great measure has been built on his braggadocio, but by contracting the disease he has so irresponsibly denied, and after the mockery of those who have taken measures to protect themselves, his falling ill is not only profoundly ironic, it is also humbling. Perhaps there is hope that this happenstance will cause a significant number of his followers to at long last peel away. With his braggadocio deflated, he may lose a significant number of votes. This may be, I think, another sign of hope. Having said that, my talk is premised on the fact that such will eventuate, and America will have an opportunity to rebuild itself out of the destruction that the incumbent administration and his sycophantic and craven followers in and out of government have brought upon us. This morning, I want to ask what kind of country and society we are, and beyond the fog of the moment, what kind of nation can we become? I am actually hopeful. I am hopeful that if we can get past November 3rd reasonably intact as a nation, that the very crisis we have suffered through for almost the last 4 years will in fact inspire a new sense of idealism. We will have turned a corner, and Americans will yearn to rebuild our nation out of the shipwreck that has dragged us down and oppressed us for too long. Again, Dr. Adler opined that we all by nature yearn for the ideal from which we always fall short. This engenders frustration. Rather than falling into despair, he asserted that our very frustration causes us to value our ideals even more. If it turns out for the better on November 3rd, I think this will be a signal of a cleansing of sort that will inspire a moral awakening among Americans, a moral awakening that is already underway. I wanted to get at what America can be by examining a theme which has long defined America and its self-understanding. It's a controversial idea that has been given different interpretations by different people at different times. And because this idea has been so malleable, I feel free to render an interpretation of my own. What I want to do is to look at the often invoked concept that America is a so-called exceptional, quote, exceptional nation that is different and unique from all others, and because of that difference has a unique role to play in the world stage. American exceptionalism is a phrase that has been invoked by political and religious leaders, political scientists and historians since before the founding of the American Republic. It's a concept that extends all the way back to the Puritans, gained definition and shape at America's founding, was invoked by such luminaries as John Kennedy and Ronald Reagan, and extends all the way to Barack Obama, who employed the idea of American exceptionalism in his own way with his own interpretation quite often. Sometimes it has been expressed, this exceptionalism, with such phrase as America is the last best hope on earth, or that, quote, we are the leader of the free world, and, quote, America is the indispensable nation. For the most part, the concept of an American exceptionalism is an idea invoked and beloved by conservatives, okay, but not exclusively by conservatives. My thesis is that the concept of American exceptionalism is primarily a negative idea. It is for the most part based on self-congratulatory mythology, and I want to expose those myths. But there may be, I think, glimmers of truth in some aspects of exceptionalism that can serve to inspire us to reconstruct our society, which needs a great deal of repair. I want to discuss these positive elements as well. So my presentation this morning is mixed and a bit complex. Let me state at the beginning that the idea that the United States identifies itself as an exceptional nation, in the first instance, I think is extremely off-putting. In its most basic sense, it reeks of arrogance, chauvinism, hubris, and collective narcissism writ large. Exceptional, quote, can readily mean better. It can be a dangerous concept whereby we give ourselves license to not play by the rules, to assert our military power at the expense of others, and as an excuse for the expansion of American political, military, and economic interests around the globe while imposing our values on others. And often it has. When I hear the claim that America is an exceptional nation, I hear synonymously that, quote, we are the greatest nation on earth, end quote, a boastful assertion that is often built, I think, on parochial blindness, ignorance, and small-mindedness. On the positive side, America's claim to be exceptional does garner respect at times from much of the rest of the world when other foreigners look, for instance, at the stability of our democratic governance, that is up until the current moment. That's been a source of pride around the world. Or the quality of our universities, which indeed are the best in the world, and the wizardry of our technological innovation and our technological achievements. These are much admired by people in the developing world, in Europe and other parts of the world around the globe. But at the same time, America's claim to be exceptional has also been a reason why so many people in foreign countries resent us. It is hard for Americans to imagine that we are not, for the most part, beloved by other people across the globe. American exceptionalism has meant many things, and I want to briefly present some of those meanings and why the idea of America as an exceptional nation is in some ways truthful, but in many other ways, again, is built on a self-aggrandizing mythology. In its first employment, which has been frequently invoked throughout American history, comes from a sermon rendered by a Puritan minister, John Winthrop, when his ship set sail for Massachusetts in 1630. Winthrop sermonized that the colony that he and his followers would found in the New World would be, quote, a city on a hill that would serve as a shining light of goodness to the rest of the world. It is that metaphor, which I think we've all heard, that America, quote, is a city on the hill, that was meant to define the special role, a unique role that America is to play in the world, that has been continually invoked and re-invoked throughout our history. But more importantly, American exceptionalism was given substance on the basis of America's founding. And here the idea, I think, I'm not cynical, has a considerable element of truth. In some ways, we are different, and in that sense, exceptional. Unlike most countries that are based on citizens' identity with the majoritarian ethnic group, such as France, Ireland, or Japan, the United States was indeed founded on a series of related ideas as articulated in our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. Among these ideas, as we know, are liberty, equality, the rights of the individual, representative democracy, and an open opportunity for social advancement. I think this is true. France, Ireland, and Japan, and virtually every other nation is grounded, as mentioned, in ethnic identity. And these countries are unified. Citizenship is unified around, belonging is unified around that identity. Although it is sociologically complex, in principle, the United States is not. In principle, to be an American is not dependent, in principle, on one's ethnicity, or shouldn't be, but in a loyalty to the ideas and ideals set forth in its founding documents. Roger Cohen, writing in the New York Times yesterday, said it eloquently when he noted, though the idea is dormant under Trump, quote, the essence of the American idea is unity under the law through and despite differences, end quote. That's a beautiful statement of what Americanism is about, okay? Unity, okay, under the law, through and despite differences. Martin Luther King, who of course fought against Jim Crow and the oppression of African Americans, gave homage to the American idea. He believed in America, implying a belief in American exceptionalism, and used that idea to try to leverage equality for the Black minority when he said as follows, and I want to quote, and I wonder how many of us recognize the source of this citation. He said, and I love this quote, When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today, he says, that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring the sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But, King says, we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. Love that line. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we have come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. Do people know where that comes from? That comes from, we all know the I Have a Dream speech, the March on Washington, August 28th, 1963. But what we know are the refrains that come at the end. Okay, I have a dream, et cetera, et cetera. What most people don't read and don't know is the beginning of that speech, which is absolutely beautiful. And he talks about cashing a check. King knew that in order to basically do an end to segregation, he needed the sympathy and support of white liberals, not merely the black community. And I say to myself, what could be more American than talking about checks and cashing checks and being bankrupt and so on and so forth? The metaphors are extremely apt and extremely powerful and beautifully rendered. He was not only a brilliant, ingenious orator, he was also a great writer and used language in the most effective, powerful way. Read the I Have a Dream speech, not long from the beginning, and you'll see those metaphors. It is absolutely marvelous. But the point is the King was basically declaring, in his view, that it was not American ideals that were wanting, but the painful reality that America has fallen woefully short on realizing them, especially, of course, as they pertain to our black minority. I don't believe, however, that Martin Luther King was an American nationalist. I think he was more accurately what we might call an Americanist, who believed in America's founding ideals from which, again, African Americans had been so unjustly excluded, and which he saw as the basis of a fully enfranchised American identity. This gestalt, I think, again, is unique to America and has framed the American identity. And so it is also true that the United States in its founding was exceptional, especially when compared to Europe, in that Americans have not been saddled with the same class-bound notion of personal identity that determines a person's social status and remains pretty much fixed throughout life. If anything, the United States was founded on a rejection of monarchy, aristocracy, and nobility, and one's place in a class-bound hierarchy. In European societies, one is born upper class or lower class, and that's where you pretty much remain for life. By contrast, I remember, and it sort of moved me, once seeing an interview with, let me wait for a second. Friends, I want you to lobby to get them to move the flight path 3 miles that way, okay? They don't fly over my house. Okay. I was very moved once. I remember watching on television, I forget who the interviewer was, the physicist I.I. Rabi, who was a very accomplished nuclear physicist who in fact won the Nobel Prize for physics. And he was saying in this interview that had he stayed in his little village, his shtetl in Poland where he was born, he could have aspired maybe to become a tailor, but America provided other opportunities. He was able to become one of the world's great physicists and win a Nobel Prize. We don't have to go that far. Bill Clinton was born into rural Arkansas, into a family of very modest means, rather dysfunctional, I should say. And of course, he rose to become president of the United States. That wouldn't happen historically in Europe. I mean, you were basically born into a class, were identified that way, treated that way, and had little opportunity for mobility. This capacity for upward mobility, again, compared to European society, the so-called American dream has been an aspect of American exceptionalism. And while many people may still believe in it, friends, the harsh truth that is that America, as the much vaunted land of opportunity, has faded into mythology. The doors are closed. The chances are, if you're born into poverty now in America, you will never get out of it. You will die. In fact, upward mobility in the United States is less mobile than it is these days in England or socialist Sweden. Okay, the doors are now closed. What was basically one of the strengths of America that attracted so many people to come here, they may still come, but in many cases, they're coming on false pretenses. The chances at the moment of moving up are virtually nil. The American dream has stalled, okay? There's an additional component to this type of exceptionalism, however, grounded in American ideals, and that is the notion that these values should be emulated. That is, liberty, democracy, individual freedom, opportunity should be emulated. Part of our self-understanding is that these ideas are precious. We give them to the world, and the rest of the world should seek to emulate them. This assumption has led to both positive and often very bad consequences. That America stands for freedom and democracy, whether we live up to these ideals or not, I think is a good thing. It is an aspect of what has been called by some political scientists America's soft power. It's one of those things that makes us attractive and increases, basically augments our strength and influence around the world. That other nations seek to emulate the values of democracy and freedom, of which they see America as a standard bearer, and choose to apply them to themselves, again, I think is something that we can applaud. I'm not cynical about that. But if we attempt to impose these values on others by military force, as we have done, for example, in Iraq, it becomes another form of imperialism and can lead to disaster, as indeed it has. Our self-understanding as exceptional has too often allowed us to give ourselves license to impose our own version on the world, impose it on others in multiple ways, including the employment of military dominance and force. There's a great deal of hubris in this. The fact that we have our values to proclaim doesn't make the United States exceptional in that many other nations have made similar claims. If we think we are exceptional because of what we can give to the world, so do others. The British, in building their empire, believed that they were bearing, quote, the white man's burden. They beguiled themselves into thinking they were doing something positive in terms of uplifting the backward masses, as they say, as they exploited those colonial people for their resources. The French justified their empire on the grounds that they had a civilizing mission. And the Soviets genuinely believed that they were leading others to a socialist utopia, despite the cruelties that were wrought by the Soviet Union. It was Obama who proclaimed his variant of American exceptionalism, which I'll get to later, who nevertheless recognized that all countries prize their own particular qualities, and therefore there's nothing exceptional about American exceptionalism, or the fact that we claim to be exceptional. All countries feel that way about themselves. It is arrogant and blind to think otherwise, and it's good to remember that when we seek as a country to impose our values on others. The embrace of our exceptional status often assumes that we behave better than other nations do, that we are in fact more virtuous. Again, a form of narcissism. In other words, again, we are a uniquely virtuous nation, but it is hardly unpatriotic to acknowledge that we are not. We like to believe that we love peace, nurture liberty, respect human rights, and embrace the rule of law. It is true that when it comes to cruelty, we have been hardly historically the worst. It has been estimated that Stalin murdered 20 million of his own citizens in a meteoric effort to industrialize the Soviet Union, and Mao in the Chinese Civil War and the Cultural Revolution maybe murdered as many, if not more. But today, we are especially reminded today of the legacy of slavery and the many millions who died in the Middle Passage during the slave trade and died under unspeakably cruel conditions. As the United States expanded from 13 states on the Atlantic coast, seizing Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California from Mexico, we virtually exterminated the indigenous populations and confined the survivors to impoverished reservations. During the Spanish-American War, okay, America was an imperialist power at one point politically. During the Spanish-American War, we killed somewhere between 200 and 400,000 Filipinos. And during the Second World War, over 300,000 German civilians. Think of the bombing of Dresden, okay, in Germany. And as we know, we are the only nation to use the atomic bomb, okay, on Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. During the Cold War, in defending freedom against totalitarian communism, we engaged in multiple proxy wars in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. We were wont to prop up with economic and military support wars in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and to basically support legions of dictators and autocrats who murdered and tortured their own people as long simply because they were anti-communist. We well remember the agony of the Vietnam War, which was part of trying to contain Soviet communism. And we know, of course, of the 58,000 of our own, 58,000 of our own soldiers whose names are beautifully inscribed in the memorial in Washington, okay? But seldom do we recall or care to recall the 1 to 3 million Vietnamese who died during that war, many from relentless American aerial bombardment. The war in Iraq, starting in March 2003, is probably the worst foreign policy blunder in the history of America. Yet few are cognizant that well over 100,000 Iraqis have died as a result of that assault and the chaos that followed and which continues, goes on and on. When it comes to human rights, and this is my field academically, the United States presents itself to its own people and to the world as the champion of human rights. Yet, in the name of our sovereignty, the United States, with few exceptions, has refused to ratify human rights treaties that would hold us accountable to international human rights standards, including some major ones. About 150 nations have ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, sometimes referred to as the International Women's Bill of Rights. We have not ratified that. Why? Because Southern senators see it as a radical feminist document. You need 2/3 of the Senate to ratify treaties. And of course, it's in control of the Senate. They see the CEDAW, the Convention on Women, as a radical feminist document that indeed will promote abortion, even though it is silent on abortion. And we're one of the few nations in the world that have not ratified it. And this is quite amazing. It makes the United States exceptional in this way. Every country in the world, without exception, has ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The only nation in the United Nations out of 193 that refuses to ratify that document is the United States of America. For a long time, we were in the same boat as Somalia, but we could forgive Somalia because it didn't have an active government to ratify it. They were able to cobble together a very tentative government in Mogadishu with enough time to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child, leaving the United States as the outlier, the only country in the world. In other words, we are willing, the point is we are willing to judge and condemn other nations for their human rights abuses, but refuse to be judged by the international community for how we treat our own citizens, okay? We treat our own citizens. When discussing human rights, the United States is exceptional again. It is an outlier, and it is not incorrect that in this regard, and the harsh term I will use, is the United States is truly hypocritical. We have two standards. And if one thinks that America doesn't suffer from its own human rights problems, we need to look no further than the treatment of our minorities and our criminal justice system. Among other things, we incarcerate prisoners in far greater numbers for much longer sentences than any other country. There is, and this is hard to believe, there is extraordinary numbers. As much as 2.8% of the entire adult population in America is in prisons or jails. The numbers are huge. When we think about torture, perhaps we think about the war on terrorism and the abuses in Abu Ghraib and the torture of terrorist suspects in black sites. But what we should do is be inspecting our own maximum security prisons, where torture, in effect, is rampant. In this case, we certainly are exceptional, but not in a way that should leave us proud. In this regard, I think we have a lot to learn from others in terms of, more humane ways of dealing with crime and so on that we do in this country. Basically, it's to punish, imprison, and throw away the key. My point here is not, believe me, to promote self-flagellation, which I don't think is attractive or a productive disposition. It is just to disavow the notion that America has any special claim on being virtuous, which I suspect many followers of Mr. Trump and many other Americans are too quick to believe, reflexively believe. We are the best nation in the world, many would proclaim, but are we really, and by what criteria? Again, it is a cry, I think, of blind narcissism that leaves reality opaque. On October 10th, Nicholas Kristof, who likes to look at things from a global perspective, had a piece in the New York Times that caught my attention. It is entitled, quote, "We're number 29 and dropping." Okay, I'd like to quote from this article extensively because I think all of us should be aware of these things. Kristof writes as follows: "This should be a wake-up call. New data suggests that the United States is one of just a few countries worldwide that is slipping backwards. The newest Social Progress Index, shared with me before its official release on Thursday morning, finds that out of 163 countries assessed worldwide, the United States, Brazil, and Hungary are the only ones in which people are worse off than when the index began in 2011, and the declines in Brazil and Hungary were smaller than America's." He goes on to say, "The data paint an alarming picture of the state of our nation, and we hope it will be a call to action." Michael Porter, a Harvard Business School professor and the chair of the advisory panel for the Social Progress Index, told me, "It's like we're a developing," Porter said, "like we're a developing country." The index, inspired by Nobel-winning economists, collects 50 metrics of well-being: nutrition, safety, freedom, the environment, health, education, and more, to measure the quality of life. Norway comes out on top in the 2020 edition, followed by Denmark, Finland, and New Zealand. South Sudan is at the bottom, with Chad, the Central African Republic, and Eritrea just behind. The United States, despite its immense wealth, military power, and cultural influence, ranks 28th, having slipped from 19th in 2011. The index now puts the United States behind significantly poorer countries, including Estonia, the Czech Republic, Cyprus, and Greece. Quote, "We are no longer the country we think we are," said Porter. "The United States ranks number 1 in the quality of our universities, but 91 in access to quality basic education. The United States leads the world in medical technology, yet we are number 97 in the access to quality healthcare. The Social Progress Index finds that Americans have health statistics similar to those of people in Chile, Jordan, and Albania, while kids in the United States, teachers should know this, get an education roughly on par with children in Uzbekistan and Mongolia. A majority of countries have lower homicide rates, and most other advanced countries have lower traffic fatalities and better sanitation and internet access. That's why this is an election like that of 1932. That was the year American voters decided decisively to reject Herbert Hoover's passivity and gave Franklin Roosevelt an electoral mandate, including a flipped Senate, that laid the groundwork for the New Deal and the modern middle class. But first we need, he says, to acknowledge the reality that we're on the wrong track. We Americans like to say we're number 1, but the new data suggests that we should be chanting, "We're number 28 and dropping." Let's wake up, for we are no longer okay, the country we think we are. That's very somber news when we look at the state of our society. You know, there are, again, with globalization and the destruction of manufacturing in the United States and the solid jobs those created, there are areas of this country that really could be part of the third world, the developing world. I remember years ago, this may have changed, there was an article on the front page of the Times that struck me. It said that the infant mortality rate in central Harlem was higher than the infant mortality rate in Bangladesh, which is one of the world's poorest countries. I mean, again, we may be the wealthiest country, but that wealth is now, in effect, not by any means equally distributed. There are third world regions of the United States and so on that compare very poorly with other parts of the world. A final expression of American exceptionalism, which arguably has some warrant, relates to America's status as the world's richest economy and by far the world's strongest military power. One could argue that with greater power and wealth comes greater responsibility. And I do believe this. As the world's richest economy, the United States, I believe, does have a special obligation to assist the poorer countries and augment our foreign aid around the world to help alleviate poverty, overcome disease, and assist refugees and displaced persons who now number a staggering 80 million. I mean, it just basically overwhelms the world's resources to deal with the refugee problem. I don't know if you read that Trump, okay, who has basically gutted our asylum process, has set just the other day a limit of only 15,000 refugees permitted to enter the United States. You know, welcoming those persecuted by their governments or fleeing war zones, that used to be a source of pride in the United States. We were pretty good about taking in those who were fleeing persecution. Obama set the bar at admitting 110,000 refugees. Trump last year lowered it to about 30, and he's lowered it again to only 15,000 at a time when the refugee flow has seldom been greater. It's to America's shame. That was something we could take pride in, but no longer. Okay. And needless to say, I think as we all would argue, we have a major role to play in combating climate destruction, to which we are a major contributor and on which the fate of the planet depends. The world has, until the Trump administration, because of our power and prestige, has looked to the United States to really set the agenda and take leadership on these issues, as I think we should. We are still the world's 800-pound gorilla. When it comes to military deployment and helping to foment peace and stability in the world, the United States, some argue, has played a positive role. Okay. The Marshall Plan after World War II helped to rebuild Europe. Okay. With it came peace and stability to the European continent, which had been at war with itself for 4 centuries, but has been at peace and unified since World War II, except, of course, for the war in the Balkans in the 1990s. We spearheaded the creation of the United Nations and ushered in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights under the leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt. The United States has its military deployed The United States has its military deployed in over 110 countries around the world. One could argue, of course, that this is an expression of American hegemony around the globe. But a counter-argument is made that America has sustained an exceptional role in maintaining international stability. And of course, we have been the major force behind NATO, which has arguably protected our Western European allies from Soviet and now Russian aggression. Donald Trump, with his quote, America first mantra, has with meteoric speed destroyed these international alliances, betrayed our allies, undermined NATO, gutted our human rights commitment, virtually destroyed our asylum process, and as mentioned, has closed the doors to refugees. an area, again, at which we could feel considerable pride. One could argue that Trump's hyperbolic chauvinism and isolationism is a malignant form of American exceptionalism on steroids. So what's left of this concept? What's redeeming about it? For that, I turn to Barack Obama, who proclaimed his own version of American exceptionalism. He often talked about America as being exceptional, but he had his own spin, which I find in effect productive and attractive. I've long been intrigued and somewhat curious and inspired by Obama's optimism, which I see as rooted in the American idea, as was Martin Luther King's optimism. I mean, Obama's a true intellectual. He's probably one of the three presidents who truly was an intellectual. Woodrow Wilson, who was the president of Princeton, we have to give it to him despite his shortcomings, and we'll give it to Thomas Jefferson. But other than that, Obama is probably one of only three presidents who's truly been an intellectual. He's extremely thoughtful, and he's no fool. He knows that his values stand in stark opposition to Trump's America's first jingoism and Trump's dystopian vision of the United States as little more than a ruin and an embattled crime scene. Obama is an optimist who cherishes American values and lauds what he sees as the American spirit and its never-ending potential. When it comes to American exceptionalism in relation to other countries, Obama has come under strident criticism from conservatives who claim that he doesn't love America enough. Why? Because he believes in multilateralism and that the United States should act in concert, not alone, but in concert with other countries and not in isolation. He was accused of denying that America is truly exceptional, for which conservatives construe as a badge of loyalty and patriotism. At a press conference early in his presidency, Obama was asked about America's role in multilateral organizations such as NATO. His answer was, "I believe in American exceptionalism, just as I suspect the Brits believe in British exceptionalism and the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism," end quote. But that was not good enough, patriotic enough, and came under blustering attack from conservative critics for whom America's superiority needs to be unqualified. But Obama went on to say, quote, "I'm enormously proud of my country and its role in history and the world. I think we have a core set of values that are enshrined in our Constitution, in our body of law, in our democratic processes, in our belief in free speech and equality, and that, though imperfect, are exceptional. Now, the fact that I'm very proud of my country," he says, "and I think we've got a whole lot to offer the world, doesn't lessen my interest in recognizing the value and wonderful qualities of other countries, or recognizing that we're not always going to be right and that other people may have good ideas, or that in order for us to work collectively, all parties have to compromise, and that includes us. And so I see no contradiction between believing that America has a continued extraordinary role in leading the world towards peace and prosperity, and recognizing that that leadership is incumbent, depends upon our ability to create partnerships, because we can't solve these problems alone," end quote. But more to the point of what we confront domestically in this dark moment are the values Obama espoused when in 2015, he made a trip to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which John Lewis crossed on the march to Selma. There and then, Obama said, quote, "What could be more American than what happened in this place?" he asked. What could more profoundly vindicate the idea of America than plain and humble people, the unsung, the downtrodden, the dreamers not of high station, not born to wealth of privilege, not of one religious tradition, but many, coming together to shape their country's course, end quote. It's a patriotism that embraces the darker moments in American history and celebrates the ability of the unsung and the outsider to challenge the country's elites. He proclaimed, Obama did, his notion of American exceptionalism again at the 2016 Democratic Convention, where he condemned Trump's resentment and blame and anger and hate as not just unexceptional, but he said literally, it's un-American. Obama said in opposition, quote, "We're challenged to do better, to be better. But as I've traveled this country through all 50 states, as I've rejoiced with you and mourned with you, what I've also seen more than anything is what is right with America. I see people working hard and starting businesses, people teaching kids and serving our country. I see engineers inventing stuff and doctors coming up with new cures. I see a younger generation full of energy and new ideas, not constrained by what is, ready to seize what ought to be. Most of all, he says, I see Americans of every party, every background, every faith, who believe that we are stronger together. Black, white, Latino, Asian, Native American, young and old, gay and straight, men, women, folks with disabilities, all pledging allegiance under the same proud flag to this big, bold country that we love. And finally, with Donald Trump as his foil, Obama then said, quote, "We are not a fragile or frightful people. Our power doesn't come from some declared savior promising that he alone can restore order. We don't look to be ruled. Our power comes from those immortal declarations first put to paper right here in Philadelphia all those years ago. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that together we the people can form a more purpose union." Now, to our ears in 2020, all this might sound a bit worn, a bit trite, but I certainly don't think it is. Obama's notion of American exceptionalism is not one of unqualified virtue, nor does he see an America devoid of imperfections. Rather, he acknowledges that we and our nation are flawed, but we can and must strive to do better, and we can hold out the faith that improvement is always possible. Well, let me say as I begin to close, though I've gotten there by a circuitous route, after the storms we confront and engulf us at this current moment, after they've passed, and I hope more than anything that they will, guided by our ideals, we need to recommit ourselves to strengthening our democracy, working for greater justice for all, and rebuilding our society so that the dignity of all men, women, and children will be upheld. We have come to the recognition, I think, that we need universal health care. Okay, that's one thing. I think any candidate who doesn't support it, however we get there, will not stand a chance. We need generous government programs to help families with childcare, maternal and paternal leave, and sick days, paid sick days. We will have to massively recalibrate, this is the hardest thing, our tax structure and close the monstrous wealth gap that closes the doors of opportunity and stokes divisions, I believe, and reinforces tribalism in American society. We will need a federal living wage, not a minimum wage, but a living wage. And we will need to rebuild labor unions and return greater bargaining power to workers. We will need to reform our criminal justice system and find ways to move away from brute incarceration to rehabilitation, guided by rational and humane ideals. Yes, of course. We will have to make a full-throated effort to establish a green economy in order to save our planet. At the local level, we need to work as a country from the top down and the grassroots up. At the local level, we will need to rebuild our democratic institutions, work to ensure inclusion, and strive to overcome racism. And we'll have to work to stitch together the American social fabric and restore human solidarity and relationships to help overcome isolation and personal desperation that leads so many people to addiction and ultimately, in many cases, to self-destruction. In short, I think we need to turn a page. I think America needs a new beginning. We'll have to dig into our resources and engage in a project of national renewal. We cannot achieve perfection, to be sure, but we can and must reverse the current slide into darkness and together reconstruct a society in which sanity and decency will prevail. Can we do this? We can, friends, and I think we must. There is no determinism, I would say, that dictates that we can't. We have much to do, and the task will be long. Americans, I do believe, are a resourceful and innovative people. We need a project of national renewal writ large. And if we succeed in turning society around, guided by our ideals and what is best in us, we will in fact prove ourselves to be exceptional in the best sense. Thank you.
Okay, David, are you going to show? I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Joe, for that exceptional address. We do have time for questions and answers. We'd like to ask all questioners to be reminded that you should ask a question and not make a statement. Limit your question to under 1 minute. And reminder that we'd like to hear from some new voices, maybe some people who might not have asked questions in the past. In this hybrid model, we are going to ask our in-person attendees to please approach the second microphone, masked and not touch the microphone. And then we're going to alternate between in-person attendees and Zoom. I'd like to now turn it over to Lenny Goldstein, our Zoom master this morning, to explain how Zoom people will raise their hands and ask anyone here to raise their hands if they'd like to ask a question.
Well, we're going to show, David's going to help me out and show the 39-second video for us on Zoom so that we can see how to do that, and then it has started.
Excuse me, are you watching a Zoom meeting? Do you know how to raise your hand? No, not that way. The moderator might not see that. It's really easy to do right from your screen. If you're on a computer, click Participants at the bottom and then Raise Hand. On a tablet, tap More and then choose Raise Hand. You can confirm it worked in the Participants panel. On a smartphone, you also tap the 3 more dots to find Raise Hand. Finally, if you dialed in from a regular phone, simply press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute. So there, no matter how you want to connect on Zoom, you know how to raise your hand.
Thanks very much, Lenny. Do we have any questions here in our in-person attendance? No? Do we have any questions on Zoom, Lenny?
We do. Janet Glass, you can unmute yourself.
Hi. So it's kind of a statement and a question. Jared Diamond wrote a book in the late 90s called Guns, Germs, and Steel, and he said that America is exceptional, but it's not because of virtue, it's because of geography, that we have 2 long coasts, great for trade, that we have very fertile soil, that we have an abundance of natural resources, coal and wood, sources of energy, that we have a variety of climates in the country. And so we're exceptional because of our geography, which gives us tremendous advantages. Joe, what do you think of that as a definition?
I think that's absolutely true. A lot of America's prosperity and its exceptional status, the extent to which we can claim that, is based essentially, Janet, I would say, on luck, on good fortune. The fact that we are separated from the rest of the world by 2 oceans, which has left us safe in the way in which the European countries and other countries on other continents are not. And we have been blessed with an extraordinary reserve of natural resources. So yes, I absolutely agree. A lot of what we construe to be our success and power in the world is based on sheer luck, a function of our geography. Let me just say, I want to welcome Len on board to our Zoom team. And it's great. You know, Rob is an actor, and the fact that he can lend his acting talent to something as pedestrian as digital technology by creating this explanatory YouTube is really great. It's very amusing. If you haven't seen it, you should look at it. It's very entertaining in and of itself. Thank you, Rob. Thanks, Len. I'll take any other questions.
Lenny, are there more Zoom?
There are
questions?
more Zoom questions. Nobody in the live audience has any questions?
No, no.
Okay, Matt Kelly, you can unmute yourself.
Hello, Joe, thank you for inspiring talk. I really appreciate it. And my question is about reaching across the aisle. It's such a divided country. I have found, and I think most of us agree, that it's such a cult of personality in, especially among Trump's fans, that as soon as you say his name, a conversation becomes hard to continue. I find that a lot of the texting and calling of voters I do, if somebody disagrees, their argument is to say Trump 2020. So Of the hopeful arguments you outlined, are certain ones, do you find certain ones more likely to resonate with folks who might be current Republican voters or not think about, a New Deal, and are others conversation blockers?
Matt, could you summarize your question again? I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. Maybe I didn't hear all of it. Could you just repeat the gist of the question?
Which parts of what you just outlined do you think would be more likely to resonate across the sort of partisan divide?
Well, one of the most fretful things about American society at the moment are the extraordinary divisions, the tribalism, the parochialism that we experience, the fraying of the American social fabric. It's very daunting, and it essentially weakens dramatically our democracy. I think, again, we need to recommit ourselves, all of us, all Americans, to our fundamental ideals and values. That needs to be the unifying, basically, the unifying substance that brings us together. However, in a practical sense, I think it's virtually impossible to engage in dialogue with someone who in effect is dogmatically rooted in their position. Studies have shown that the more rational your arguments with someone who opposes you, the more firmly committed they become to their position. That the type of dialogue across these extreme differences politically, and I'm thinking of those people, not that we should give ourselves high marks, we are all committed to our own values too, which we stubbornly cling to. But there is a cultic dimension to many of Trump's followers, which I find very disturbing, in part because the numbers are so large. I mean, we're talking about tens of millions of people. And I did interview a writer who wrote a book about Trump as a cult figure, analyzing, the power of cult leaders and the disposition psychologically of their founders. And he identifies Trump as a true cult leader and his followers as part of a cult. Very difficult to dislodge. I don't think it could be done indirectly through dialogue. You can try with your neighbor, Matt, if you wish, but I'm not sure how far we can go in that regard. I think our best hope in terms of undoing this tribalism is through indirection. I would like to believe that if a new regime acting quickly can institute well-deployed federal programs that are extremely generous, that speak to people's basic needs, primarily health, okay, and their economic wherewithal, that indeed, that over time, even though I'm not an economic determinist, that over time, that in effect, economic support and enabling people to feel more secure about their futures and that of their children will psychologically lessen the grip that those people who have a type of dogmatic and cultic investment in Donald Trump currently have. I know, and reports, journalists have shown how people in effect will support him even if they know that he will take away their health care. Even if their own children are dependent on government health care, they will nevertheless deny their own self-interest in order to support him. It is a very naughty thing. By the way, in the current moment, I read a survey that 84% of Republicans basically support Trump in his effort to demolish the Affordable Care Act, okay, which he's trying to do through the Supreme Court. That would do away with the protections you have for pre-existing conditions. 84% of people support that. And Republicans in decades, including Trump, have not come up with an alternative health plan. I mean, this feels to my mind as suicidal as any political advocacy could possibly be. Yet it's still my hope that if the government can be understood as a friend to the people and not as an enemy, as Ronald Reagan trained people to believe, but can see as a friend by supporting people's basic economic security, that economic groundwork will begin to transform people's psychologies and their values and break down this very ominous, hideous, difficult wall of political tribalism that so fractures American society. I think that's our best hope. And so my strategy is one that is economically based, generous, well deployed, okay, and it's a method of indirection. That's the best I can do. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay, Ed Gross, you can unmute yourself.
There we go. Thanks, Joe, for this talk. And as a small note, I'm not hearing the planes overhead on Zoom this time. I think Perry may have arranged it better, and your stopping wasn't necessary from my point of view. Anyway, quick question. What role do you think the teaching of history in our schools plays into the misunderstanding of American exceptionalism, or the understanding of it as only a positive? You've got to start with Washington and all the great things that our founders did, but it seems to me that there may be the roots of the misunderstanding as early as elementary school. What do you think?
I'm not a public school teacher, but I read enough to know about this, that the whole issue of school curriculums are heatedly fought out and are incredibly politicized, including who writes the textbooks and how they are written. Okay, that is a major battlefield in public education and so forth. I agree. I mean, again, I think that the explanation for the fracturing of America is best understood through an economic and sociological lens, but education has a great deal to do with it. I sometimes scratch my head and ask myself, how is science taught in rural Arkansas? I mean, don't students have science classes? I mean, aren't they taught about the importance of evidence in terms of coming to conclusions and so on and so forth? I mean, something as basic as that. So yes, I would argue that our teaching and our education of children starting very young needs to be drastically improved. Okay, we've got to look, we can't be a great nation unless if we default on educating our children. It simply cannot be done. And we've got to get serious about improving the quality of education, which means giving teachers a decent, respectable wage, okay? In Finland, which produces the best results in terms of public education, pays its teachers on the level that we pay our doctors, okay? Teachers are seriously respected and revered, and to become a teacher is not easy, okay? It's not, you don't become a teacher by being a flunky. You become a teacher by basically taking a series of exams that are as rigorous as the ones that you need to get into law school. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to adopt those standards, but I'm saying we cannot be a great nation and pull ourselves together unless we make a serious investment in the improvement of basic education, which we have not done. I think it's seriously lacking. So again, it is not the prime explanation for the dissolution of the American fabric, but I think it's an important one. We have to improve our science education. We have to improve our basic education. And one thing that you didn't mention that I would mention, which goes untaught in the schools, okay, is civics education. My goodness, how many people can't name a single justice on the Supreme Court? How many people can't name the 3 branches of government? Okay, how many people don't know their own senators and so on and so forth? How many people don't understand the nature, including Donald Trump, the importance of checks and balances in terms of maintaining a viable democracy? Americans are woefully ignorant about how their own government is supposed to function. So in addition to science education, in addition to accurate history education that basically tells both sides, we need a very thorough, heavy dose of civic education in our public schools because I think we're severely without it, okay? It's extremely, essentially important, okay? Education won't solve all our problems, but my goodness, it's essential if we're going to solve them at all.
Okay.
End of sermon.
All right. So I have GG. You can lower your hand and ask your question.
Hi, GG is Greg Gordon. Hi, everybody.
Thank you, Greg. I'll put your name in there then.
So what struck me as part of this discussion, Joe, was the term just at face value of exceptionalism, which I think inherently means that it brings some measure of comparison between us as a country and another country. And so to correlate against that comparison, the sort of superlative nature of how Trump describes America, the best, the greatest, this America first nationalistic view, inherently brings about that same sort of notion of comparison, us against somebody else. Now, it's no mystery, I think, for many of us on this call, how we believe Obama's presidency went versus, stark contrasts around how Trump has governed the country over the last almost 4 years. But I think there's some measure of commonality in the context of comparing us to someone or some larger community outside of the US. And so, Joe, I guess the question that I would pose to you is, clearly there are stark differences between those two presidencies, but in the context of measuring ourselves, is it totally fair to use that basis of comparison to sort of, augment or support our belief in who we are as a country, as a people? Or is it, is there a better approach or perhaps a different approach to just look at ourselves in terms of measuring against a value system?
Yes, I mean, I think it's a very good question, Greg. Good to hear you. Yeah, I started off by saying that the primary valence of the idea of exceptionalism is very negative and indeed dangerous, although there are glimmers of its positive employment. I think as long as the world is divided into nation states, it's inevitable that there are going to be comparisons between the countries, okay? And I think narcissism, which is inherent in us, including basically collective narcissism, is going to basically cause many Americans to feel a sense of pride in their own country, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. It can be employed by the right leadership for very good ends. Let me just say, yes, we need to measure ourselves against basically a less competitive scale of values. That would be optimal and ideal. But I just want to leave with the thought that I was trying to get across, that both Donald Trump and Barack Obama believe in American exceptionalism, but in very different ways. Trump's belief is a form of malignant chauvinism that indeed leads to American isolationism in the world, okay? Make America great again. America first, by the way, which was a rallying cry among Americans who were sympathetic to Nazism during World War II. That was a battle cry, America first. I don't know if Trump realizes that. But the difference between the two is that Obama's sense of exceptionalism, and this goes to the heart of his own personal philosophy, which I've read a great deal about, basically is shaded by a great deal, as I tried to point out, a great deal of humility. In other words, he is totally accepting of the fact that human beings are flawed and that the United States is flawed, that we have many, many problems that we need basically to work on and to redress. That is a very different way of understanding, a self-understanding of what America is, than indeed the more chauvinistic, patriotic forms of exceptionalism, which have generally been its standard employment throughout history. We find it in Ronald Reagan, who used the city on the hill metaphor over and over and over again, but he meant that America was virtually a perfect society that had nothing to learn from others. That has not been Obama's view, and I think Obama's view of exceptionalism, to the extent to which one holds to that view, accepts American exceptionalism, is a much better, more realistically based and less dangerous view of looking at it. And that led Obama to basically respect our international alliances. And he did say this over and over again: we can't go it alone. America is part of the mosaic together with our allies. Trump thoroughly denies that and shreds it, and basically sucks up to dictators and autocrats while he betrays our historical alliances with European democracies and other countries that hold to values, democratic values, that are closer to our own. So I'm sorry I can't give you a full answer, but yes, ideally, I think if we measured ourselves against, in effect, ideals, and not in a comparative sense. Ethically, we'd probably be standing on higher ground. But I think it's inevitable that all countries collectively engage, and people within it engage in some form of narcissism, as long as we're divided into nation states. Okay, thanks.
Okay, Marinka, you can unmute yourself.
Yes, it's a question from me, Peter. I just wondered to what extent the citizens' deliberation that led to a solution, or at least a pathway to a solution, for instance, in France on the climate agreements, or in Ireland on abortion, and also we in the Netherlands, we are working on the citizens' deliberation, would be a way to solve the bipartisan situation. And I'm just curious whether you think it could be a solution and would stand any chance in the United States, whereby you aselectly pick out 500 people to solve a problem.
This is our friend and member Peter Haring from the Netherlands, and I'm sort of chuckling because his question is so Dutch. Let me tell you, I mean, Holland is not a perfect society, and I have friends in Holland, Peter and others whom I correspond with, and Holland is going through some very bad times. Holland's healthcare system, very vaunted, is beginning to suffer basically from infirmities. And indeed, as we know, there are strong right-wing and nationalistic, fascistic parties in the Netherlands that are very disturbing, as there are in France and in Germany, of all places, where they've infiltrated the police forces and so on. Very, very disturbing trends throughout Europe. And of course, Trumpism is a part of that illiberalism and neo-nationalism, which is very disturbing. But let me just say, I like your approach, Peter. It sounds very Dutch to me, and maybe I'm stereotyping and idealizing a little bit. One of the things I love about Holland is that the Dutch tend to be rationalists when it comes to social problems. That is, they seem to believe, and I'm probably overstating this, that any social problem is subject to some form of solution, or at least improvement, by getting people together, as you say, and sitting down and talking about it and trying to rationally come up with the best approach. As we all know, I'll give you the dramatic example. Holland, of course, has legalized prostitution. Anyone who's been to Amsterdam has probably taken a tour through the red light district. You can conclude that's autobiographical if you wish, but it is a tourist attraction. And the Dutch, of course, I mean, my understanding is, and it's tightly controlled. I mean, the sex workers are licensed. They have alarm buttons to call in case the Johns get out of control. They're unionized in many cases. In many cases, they're individual entrepreneurs. They truly are sex workers, and it's tightly organized. And my understanding is that when it came to that problem, as a model for other problems, the Dutch said, look, no society in the last 10,000 years has been able to suppress or eradicate prostitution. We can't either, but the best we can do is to try to contain it through, in effect, legalizing it and attempting to put in rules and regulations that ensure that it is basically doesn't get out of hand. Now, that's causing a lot of problems because of the illegal sex trafficking trade that grows up around it, and there are all kinds of difficulties. It hasn't been a perfect solution, but it's one way. Yes, the Dutch are rationalists, and I wish we were too. I wish we could say, yeah, we'll get 500 experts together on climate change and work out the most rational approach to a Green New Deal, okay, and transforming to alternative energy. I wish we had that in our culture. We tend to be much more fractious, far more libertarian and argumentative than that, and less cooperative. Holland is a Western society, but it's a communitarian society with communitarian values that America does not have for the most part. We are more committed to an hyper-individualism and a type of libertarianism as part of the American gestalt. I don't share those values, but it tends to be the major drift of American history and our social reality, which is unfortunate. So yes, I wish we could do that. Let me just say one thing on his behalf. Barack Obama may not go down as a great president, but I'll tell you, I gotta say, when it came to the Paris Accords, I mean, I can't think of an international treaty where all 193 countries around the globe bought into it. It's not perfect. It's not adequate by any means, but he was able to take the leadership, sat down with the Chinese, okay, which is the, you know, the second worst polluter in the world, soon to be the first. Okay, I was able to sit down with the Chinese and get their cooperation. Again, this was American leadership in the best sense. And I think Obama was able to do it through negotiation, okay, and so forth, and get every country in the world on board with the Paris climate change. It was quite an achievement. Okay, so there's an example of the use of mediation and diplomacy to basically reach benevolent conclusions. We've done that in other cases. I've been amazed at how negotiation has sometimes been able to resolve what you would assume have been deep-reaching, chronic problems of contention and warfare that have gone back for centuries. I remember listening to George Mitchell and how he brokered the Good Friday Accords in Northern Ireland, okay? I mean, Catholics and Protestants were killing each other, okay, for decades. And he was able to sit down with both parties, bring them together and negotiate a solution. Jimmy Carter in 1979 was able to broker a deal, okay, between Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin that put half the Arab world practically is Egyptian, put half the Arab world at peace, cold peace, at peace with Israel through negotiation. Sometimes that works. So yes, I agree with you. I think it would be marvelous if we had such panels and we were committed in that way. Yeah, great idea. And thanks for asking the question.
Okay, Edward, did you want to ask a question? If you do, please do. Unmute yourself. No?
Okay.
There we go.
It's interesting because I live about a mile away from you, Joe, and I hear the very same planes that come over your place, although at a much reduced volume. And then I kind of experience what you're hearing and note the difference. But yeah. So that's an aside, but I wanted to go back to the rankings of countries in various parameters of, you know, quality of life. And I guess it's true for every country, but I think in our case, if you, I don't want to say dismissed or eliminated, but if you only considered or if you didn't look at the most disadvantaged segments of society, I think you would see that the indicators would be far more favorable, which, you know, in my mind just implies that any policies that you try to implement to raise the standards of care or address the deficiencies should be targeted and focused on those needy communities and not just be, you know, dribbled away across the whole country, irrespective of the need. And I think that's where, you know, some policy guidance would come into play.
Yeah, well, Ed, I agree with you 100%. I'm an egalitarian, and I'll admit, like Bernie Sanders, I'm a democratic socialist, and I believe in government support and intervention in terms of redistributing wealth in this country. We have, with basically the elimination of regulations, we've created a unbridled laissez-faire capitalist economy that pushes the wealth up into smaller and smaller hands and to tighter concentrations. And in effect, the 1% or the top 10% own what? 90% of the economy, and everyone else, including the middle class, is struggling to survive. I mean, the middle class is eroding and falling out the bottom. We destroyed labor unions. Only 10% labor is unionized now, and therefore bargaining power has shifted to employers and away from workers. I think we need to restore the power of labor unions and with a view towards, in effect, generating a more egalitarian society. And it's government that has to do that. Government is us. I mean, again, we were taught, starting with Reagan, that government is an enemy of the people. How preposterous and how dangerous. Okay, our government is not our enemy. It is us basically expressing our collective will in terms of creating the society we democratically want to have. We need to see government. Of course, there's plenty of government waste. There's corruption. There are lots of problems. Very often government is inefficient and so on. We know all that. That is true. We've got to make it better. But see government as an expression of the collective will. It is us. My commitment is towards economically a more egalitarian society. You know, if I've got to pay more for everyone to have access to quality healthcare, I will do that. Okay, we owe it to each other. I mean, that really is morally not defensible. Healthcare is a human right. It is not a commodity like an iPhone or a new camera that you purchase. Nobody chooses to get sick. It's part of the existential condition of the human being. And therefore, it should be a responsibility of all of us to ensure that whether you're healthy or not, whether you live or die, is not dependent on your privileged status to be able to purchase health care. And if you're poor, well, too bad, you go without it. That is not the hallmark of a decent, humane society. We should start with that. And I think more people, I mean, look, tagging your healthcare to your employment is not a great idea. When you lose your job, you lose your healthcare. And look at all the people, the tens of millions with COVID-19 who have lost their jobs and their healthcare and soon to lose their homes too. We're not in good shape. And we weren't in good shape before the virus hit. You know, we really have to revamp our economy. Very hard to do because those who hold the wealth hold the power, but we've done it before. I've pointed out in the Gilded Age, basically, that was similar to our own, with the super wealthy and industrialists owning the wealth, was met by the progressive era, the progressive movement that eventually laid the groundwork for the New Deal. And we in many ways transformed the society. We need to do it again. And I think we can do it again. But we have to have the will to do it again. We have to stand up, basically, to the plutocrats, okay, and take back that economic power, okay? And with it will come political power.
That's all the questions we have from the Zoom audience.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Joe, once again. Oh, Harry has a question.
I have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I had my hand up, but my hand up said here. So and I have a quick question. I guess I'll pose it along the model of Peter and Marinka, the Dutch model. Hi, Peter. Hi, Marinka. And I'm going more towards the psyche of Americans as being an issue. In the Dutch model, you have a country that's basically below sea level, and there's an assured mutual survival or destruction. If your neighbor doesn't maintain their property and their dike, your home or field gets flooded. Now, here in America, with this American exceptionalism, or shall we say American individualism, we've found a situation where we're faced with, for example, the coronavirus. This is an overarching problem that is affecting all levels of society, from the very top, as we see with our leader, such as he is, right down to the bottom. But yet people can't seem to coalesce around this idea of taking very simple steps to protect themselves and their society. And I'm wondering how much of this you place at the hands of our government in terms of leadership, which there's certainly a big chunk of it, and how much could be placed on ourselves as just not having a psyche of viewing us as a whole.
Well, thanks for that important question. The coronavirus is not only a medical problem, it's an ethical one as well. And of course, the answer to that question, it's both. I think if we had true leadership at the top, okay, who basically, without qualification, followed the science and scientific expertise and was able to basically enunciate the wearing of masks and social distancing and hand washing and those very simple things that we need to do, and say it in a loud, unqualified voice, that leadership would be very, very, very useful. Secondly, I think the federal government has failed to unify the country on the basis of the states. This is a national, it's a global problem, but it's certainly a national problem that calls for federal and national response. And what we've done, of course, is fragmented and segmented the problem and given it over to the 50 individual states to deal with it how they do. And each one has dealt with it differently, very often to the tune of politicization. So yes, I think leadership was absolutely crucial in this case. People have noted that unspeakable thousands have died as a result of Trump's basic foolishness and irresponsibility on this. I agree with that. He has blood on his hands in that regard, and others, but in that regard, very dramatically. But what you're also saying is true. The basic, going back to frontier days, and this has been said many times, the United States is committed to, as its main gestalt, a type of individualism. I think it's morphed into hyper-individualism in many ways and has left a lot of people isolated and lonely and despairing as a result. It has helped to free the American fabric, but we do have a strong individualistic and libertarian commitment, which does not serve us well in this regard. I mean, I think it's totally idiotic and morally responsible out of a sense of individualized machismo, to say, I won't wear a mask, okay? Nobody's going to tell me what to do. Well, that's a reprehensible, from a moral point of view, reprehensible point of view. I'd like that person to think about the healthcare worker, the nurse, who will be forced to be on the front lines and put herself in great danger because of your ethical responsibility and refusing to mask, as well as everyone else. Yeah, that libertarianism does not help us. I just want to tell an anecdote. A story which is delicious. Years ago, I served on the board of the International Humanist and Ethical Union, which is our international organization that was headquartered in Utrecht in the Netherlands. And the director of it was a Dutchman, a professor. And I once told him the story of the little Dutch boy, which is, do you recall that? Were you told that story when you were a kid, right? Fairy tale about heroism, about the dike, and it has a crack in it and develops a hole. And if indeed the crack grows, the dike will collapse and the countryside will be flooded and underwater. And so what he does out of an act of heroism, he sticks his finger in the hole in order to prevent the leakage and so on and so forth. And he's a hero. And I told this to my Dutch colleague. He said, not only have I never heard that story, that simply could not be written by a Dutch person. Why? Because we do not valorize in Holland that type of individualized heroism. And you know what? When he came back, I looked it up. I did the research. He was absolutely correct. The story of the little Dutch boy sticking his finger in the dike was written by an American. It was an American author that reflects an American viewpoint. So you have, again, in that fable, you have different social values being portrayed. Yes, I think we are